my understanding that Michael Ciaravino, the city manager of the city of Newburgh, has arrived. Would you please come forward? You found traffic on your way here?
Yes, sir.
Please have a seat. If misery loves company, I experienced traffic on the world's largest parking lot known as the Long Island Expressway, which probably was similar to your experience in a different parking lot.
Yes, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for your perseverance and for being with us, and the forum is yours.
Thank you. My name is Michael Ciaravino. I'm the city manager for the city of Newburgh, New York. A couple of years ago, I had the unfortunate responsibility to declare an emergency with respect to Washington Lake Reservoir water, which the city of Newburgh has drawn upon historically as its primary source of drinking water. For orientation, the Stewart Air Force airfield, which is part of the watershed for the city of Newburgh, is located approximately 150 feet above the Washington Lake Reservoir. And as we all know, water flows downhill. So whatever has occurred with regard to toxicity in the watershed ultimately makes its way down into the city of Newburgh drinking water. And when we discovered that we had the perfluorinated compounds in our water, the PFAS that has been in the news, I had to shut off the Washington Lake Reservoir as a primary source of drinking water for the city. We then switched to a pond close by called Brown's Pond. Brown's Pond had approximately 30 days of drinking water in it. Lucky for us, unlike the folks in Flint, Michigan and Hoosick Falls that needed to then rely upon bottled water, the city of Newburgh was fortunately located close to the Catskills Aqueduct. And through a lot of far-sighted management practices in past decades, we were able to make quick modifications to our emergency infrastructure, and we're able to draw upon the Catskills Aqueduct water in order for us to continue supplying the city of Newburgh with its drinking water needs. Fast forward to today, the state of New York, which, by the way, owns the property at Stewart Airfield and leases or licenses that property through the Port Authority, ultimately to the Air Force reserves, made the decision to modify our water treatment plant and converting it to best practices technology of this era called granular activated carbon. The granular activated carbon, we understand, is very effective at filtering out what's called long-chain perfluorinated compounds. It's a product that's manufactured by Calgon. We are in the very, very late stages of completion on the construction of this new granular activated treatment plant. We are not certain if the monies have been drawn from the Superfund or other sources of funding for the city of Newburgh. But a number of issues remain, which I will expound upon a little bit later in the testimony. But in a nutshell, we are concerned about other compounds that may actually break through granular activated carbon that have been reported anecdotally and otherwise as existing in the watershed that may also exist as part of the lands that are owned by the state of New York. And at the end of the day, we understand that the Department of Defense and the state of New York may potentially head into litigation over the issue of who is ultimately responsible for what has befallen upon the citizens of the city of Newburgh and those others that drink our water. One of the issues in the DOD defense, as we understand it, is that their licensing agreement that is held or negotiated through the Port Authority holds them harmless for any tortious acts, environmentally tortious acts, which may have occurred on the premises before they occupied it as part of the Air National Guard or while they're in operation of it. That would include certainly the weekly firefighting drills that we understand utilize this firefighting foam that had the PFAS in it. And certainly also included a couple of the more important accidents that have occurred there, significant accidents, I should say, where a tremendous volume of firefighting foam was poured down. When this whole issue started, the threshold in the EPA guidelines was for 200 parts per trillion for the PFAS. Judy Yank, the Region 2 administrator, lowered that threshold after the Hoosick Falls issue provisionally to 70 parts per trillion, and then ultimately that threshold, I believe, was adopted by Region 2, but also as well as the entire rest of the EPA. The measures in the PFAS at the time I shut down Washington Lake measured around 145 parts per trillion. So while it was below the then 200 part per trillion threshold, it was way above the then reconstituted threshold of 60 parts per trillion. Since then, we have discovered just upstream, one of the main tributaries that comes into Washington Lake measures at around 5,900 parts per trillion for PFAS. As a result of this measure, we shut down the diversion gate that would have allowed that water to come into the Washington Lake Reservoir. Now, this is significant because between the waters that we've now had to divert, as well as another area, another tributary called Patton Brook, these two areas account for almost 2/3 of the water that supplies the drinking water for the city of Newburgh. So in addition to the contamination issue, we also have the capacity issue that is potentially going to force the city of Newburgh to decide, do they want to open the diversion gate and allow this PFAS infested or PFAS infected water, excuse me, wrong term, PFAS poisoned water to come in at 5,900 parts per trillion? Or do we want to keep the gate closed and possibly suffer the capacity issue that will ultimately draw down the water in Washington Lake? What I would ask is the legislature considers funding for this coming year is the ability for the city of Newburgh to continue to draw upon the Catskills Aqueduct water as a sole capacity issue in addition to the toxicity issue, while we're able to address what it is that the Department of Defense is going to do, how the state and the Department of Defense are going to determine their relative liabilities amongst each other, and then ultimately how the city of Newburgh can recover this loss of capacity that we expect is going to be longer term than any of us would prefer. I mentioned Patton Brook earlier. That's an area that borders the southeast quadrant of the I-87, I-84 overpass. Part of that area also is included in our Washington Lake Reservoir watershed. This area once had a forest up there that helped us with filtering our water, but brought water down from Patton Brook to the Washington Lake Reservoir. As a result of this massive new construction as part of the Matrix Pharmaceutical Warehouse, our capacity has also been impacted as well from these two sources. As I'll allude to a little bit later in my testimony, the fact that this is able to happen in our watershed speaks to where we need to be legislatively, hopefully very soon, in terms of modern best practices for watershed management in the state of New York. While we don't believe in any way that what's befallen on this city is a blessing, we do see it as an opportunity in light of this crisis for the state of New York to consider what our best practices in the coming decades and centuries for our children, our grandchildren, and for ourselves as it relates to how we're going to manage this increasingly scarce commodity on planet Earth, and that's namely our capacity to drink water. When we consider the examples of our forefathers and foremothers, the far-reaching thoughts that they had about such cutting-edge techniques as equal voting rights, women's suffrage, and others, we will also be looked to in this era for the no-brainer way in which we approach this obvious issue of drinking water. We cannot survive simply without the capacity to drink our water. And so as we are possibly muddling the relative liabilities, looking at the price or the cost for this versus the other, at the end of the day, while the MTA I may have been delayed in getting here, we can do without transportation. It's not convenient. We cannot do without water. It is more than inconvenient. It is life-threatening if we do not have fresh drinking water. Many have predicted that the battles of the last 50, 60 years over oil are nothing. They're minuscule compared to what we will be battling over in order to be able to drink the life-sustaining water that all of us need on a daily basis. And so when we look at the no-brainer decisions that were made politically in past eras, we should also consider that right now we have an opportunity, whether it's the crisis in Hoosick Falls, the crisis in Long Island, the crisis in the city of Newburgh, to ask ourselves what is happening legislatively, what has happened regulatorily, what are the opportunities that we have to fund this in a manner so that we can learn and grow from these three examples, as we certainly can anticipate in this era in which contaminants are no longer measured in parts per billion, they're measured in parts per trillion. And as the science improves and as the science enables us to appreciate what is happening to us physiologically, for example, with PFAS, a whole host of cancers, cholesterol issues, other parts of the body, testicular cancers, we're discovering now this emerging contaminant has a direct correlation with these types of physiological maladies. It's only the beginning. The science is only going to get better. Measuring at parts per trillion, I believe that in our lifetimes it's going to be measured at an even more minuscule measure. And with that has come the discovery of what these contaminants are doing in our system. We want to extend our appreciation to the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Health for their work and their devotion to helping our communities in the face of our water contamination crisis. Nearly a year and a half later, we still sadly do not have answers to many of our questions. We find ourselves in a frightening situation where we not only have many unanswered questions about the state of our health in the water, but at a recent City Council meeting, we learned that Newburgh will also be switched back to our highly polluted water source at this point, Washington Lake, which will serve as the entire city's drinking water supply. I say that we will also be switched back because at the end of the day, right now, we are being reimbursed for the water we are drawing from the Catskills Aqueduct. It is my understanding that once it's determined that the water is drinkable by whoever's standard, we are then going to be forced and confronted with the dilemma in our city of whether we want to raise our water rates in order to continue to pay to drink from the Catskills Aqueduct supplied water, or if we want to switch back to the Washington Lake Reservoir. And with that, the capacity issues that I referenced earlier and some of the other contamination issues that I will be more specific about momentarily. I believe that myself, along with several members of City Council, many members of our community, are strongly opposed to switching back to Washington Lake at this time, and we would respectfully ask the New York State Assembly to consider funding the City of Newburgh's ability to continue to draw off the Catskills water until a whole host of unanswered questions are addressed. We must know what is in our water supply before going back to it. Simply put, the community was outraged to learn that there was PFAS in our water and asked many, many pointed questions about how could you have not known this? How could you have? The only answers we had were that these were emerging contaminants that none of us knew about. We now know at least about this emerging contaminant called PFAS and the other perfluorinated compounds, but only a little bit. We're still not able to answer to our community as to what the health impacts are and at what threshold levels are acceptable for human consumption. Although the EPA has lowered the threshold to 60 parts per trillion, we respectfully suggest that the acceptable threshold should be somewhere below 1 part per trillion before any of us are expected to drink the water. We are calling on the Department of Environmental Conservation to conduct a full Superfund analysis of Washington Lake, which includes the full semi-volatile and volatile organic scan and pesticide scan. We also want to test for short-chain perfluorinated compounds in addition to the long-chain perfluorinated compounds, which have already been tested in Washington Lake. We understand that the product that's provided by Calgon and the granular activated carbon is effective at filtering out the long-chain perfluorinated compounds, but not the short-chain. We want to test for chemicals that studies have indicated could break through the granular activated carbon systems, which include acetone, methylene chloride, acetyl 1-propanol acronyl, forgive my pronunciations, propanonite trial, I practiced on the way down here, but dimethylformaldehyde, propylene, 1,4-dioxane, tetrahydrofran, isopropyl alcohol, urea, and other compounds. As part of the public hearings and meetings that we've had up in Newburgh regarding this, A very interesting gentleman came to the microphone at the very end of one of our sessions at the Mount St. Mary College and said that he knows where all the bodies or the skeletons are in the Washington Lake watershed. And I took the time to meet with this gentleman. He actually provided for us some testimony under oath, in which we transcribed. And he basically related a very disturbing conversation related to the dumping that he knew about as a former electrical contractor up by the Stewart Airfield. He also mentioned at one time that the apron of the driveway that currently goes into the Air Force Base, just west of it, was a dumping area, a trench pit area, which he explained the organized crime elements from New York State would drive up to Newburgh, come along Route 17, and would dump in this hole just west, or excuse me, just east of the apron of the Air Force Base. If you look at the infrastructure map of the Air Force Base, there's two 24-inch pipes that traverse in a north to southerly direction, basically from the general area where this apron of the driveway is that leads into the Air Force Base. We are informed by Mr. Brand from the DEC that about halfway into the Air Force Base, there is these two pipes, these 24-inch pipes are crushed, which would seem to indicate to many of us that whether it was intentional or unintentional, these pipes then were able to receive, who knows, untold volumes of dumping and toxicity from other places in this state, and were brought to this airfield as a convenient place to do it, right at the Route 17 area by the apron of the driveway. What further concerns us, again, being explained anecdotally, and we're working with very limited resources to confirm this geologically, is that there is a type of rock that's under the Stewart Airfield that acts as a saucepan. It's an impermeable saucepan. And this saucepan, with every rain, allows out a little more of the trickles. Whether these two 24-inch pipes that are crushed about halfway in are located within the saucepan, I'm not able to have the resources to answer that question at this time. But what is important is that right now in those trench pits that surround the Air Force Base, the DEC themselves have announced that the levels of PFAS that they have measured in these trench pits measure in the hundreds of thousands of parts per trillion, well in excess, obviously, of the 60 part per trillion EPA threshold. What that suggests to us is that if we are forced to open up Silver Stream Gate in order to have the capacity for more water, we are going to, besides the ick factor, we are going to be subjecting our residents not only to potential breakthrough exposure for perfluorinated compounds, if the towers, the granular activated filtration towers, are overcapacitated, but it's also going to expose us to some other compounds that may or may not be able to be held back with the granular activated carbon. So what we really want to do, again, I want to thank Martin Brand and his very capable team of engineers for the good faith effort and hustle that they have done to put together this granular activated filtration system for the city of Newburgh and all the residents outside our city that drink on a regular basis. But we think it's too fast to rush back to the Washington Lake water as our source of water. We understand that the New York DEP continues to do work on the Catskills Aqueduct in advance of its work on the Delaware Aqueduct. And we understand that there is the ability now, with all the infrastructure improvements, for us to fill up Browns Pond again, so that during these shutdown periods where they do the maintenance work and repair work on the Catskills Aqueduct, we would have the opportunity to draw down the water from Browns Pond. But we then want to be able to go back to the Catskills rather than going to Washington Lake, because of the capacity issues, certainly, but especially because of the unanswered questions as it relates to the toxicity issues. The next discussion I want to switch from is to watershed management. And I believe that as the New York State Assembly considers how to fund going forward, that this is also a very important part of that conversation that's forward-thinking as it relates to the next decade and the next century of those that drink water in the state of New York. And I would also add, might be able to offer a best practices model for other states in the union as to how to address this PFAS crisis and others. We understand that this firefighting foam is now being discovered at many, many other military bases around the United States. And there is certainly, perhaps in this era, at the national level, little appetite for acknowledging reality. But at our level, I believe that we have the opportunity to at least continue the dialogue, to develop both the physical infrastructure and architecture, but also the legal and political architecture, so that we're able to address the needs of our grandchildren and our children. And with all the recent public attention on drinking water, source water protection is more important than ever. For example, in the city of Newburgh, our Washington Lake Reservoir is located outside the city. It shares the land that's the political jurisdiction of the town of New Windsor and the town of Newburgh. As I mentioned earlier, it also intersects with I-84 and I-87. The land in this watershed has been developed really without stopping since the last decade. In the middle of this crisis is when the Matrix Pharmaceutical Warehouse that I mentioned earlier was constructed. And not only are the short-term reactive actions needed for watershed management, such as our emergency bottled water, blood tests, and emergency filtration systems, but longer-term proactive actions are needed as well, such as source water protection programs and watershed-based approach addressing problems. Drinking water issues do not seem likely to fade anytime soon. Advanced detection technologies are allowing us to find new contaminants faster than we can conduct medical research to understand the potential health impacts. More and more communities are starting to ask questions about their drinking water, and water treatment operators are retiring in waves with not enough well-qualified operators to take their places. Again, this is a funding challenge as operators retire, and increasing scarcity, the Department of Health will tell you, is very well known with type 1 operators in the state of New York. This is another area for funding. Growing communities continue to increase their demand for clean water, and new climate and precipitation patterns, including extremes such as flood and drought, will continue to impact drinking water quality and quantities in ways that are not well understood at this time. Source water is a part of the water use cycle, and source watersheds, whether they be urban concrete jungles or natural forests and wetlands, or a mixture of both, should be recognized as part of the water use cycle to achieve effective management strategies. What I have attempted to explain is what a watershed is in my community is I hold up a really, really big funnel that our water superintendent, Mr. Wayne Vandenberg, purchased at Walmart, which is in our watershed, by the way. They hold up the funnel, and in that are a whole bunch of big box retail chain stores, a bunch of closed landfills, a town of New Windsor landfill that has been capped and closed is in our watershed, and a number of other major industries, including the Matrix Pharmaceutical Warehouse at the top, are located in our watershed. Source water is not currently being protected in a deliberate, effective way. There are existing regulations and policies that specifically address drinking water, but these are mostly focused on standards for finished water and do not focus on the source of water or the ability for us to protect our watershed. There are existing regulations and policies related to watersheds and water quality, and some of these happen to benefit drinking water sometimes in certain places. But these regulations focus on ecosystem and environmental protection, again, not on drinking water. This is going to require a dedication of resources that are significant, but are also going to be considered, as I mentioned earlier, something that most of us in the next 30, 40 years are going to say, well, of course you had to do that. I respectfully submit that now is the time for us to take a look at how we're going to dedicate resources. Below are some of the ideas that improve source water protection. Number one, we need to strengthen current, now existing regulatory frameworks. I've asked at a few of our meetings with the Department of Environmental Conservation, what are the regulations that you currently have on the books that are just simply not being enforced? What are the regulations that you currently have right now that are not being paid attention to? I'll give you an example from the Newburgh watershed. A number of years ago, there was an error. Some conspiracy theorists believe it was deliberate. I don't have enough evidence to decide that incorrectly designated our Silver Stream tributary, which primarily feeds into the Washington Lake Reservoir that the city of Newburgh has historically drank their drinking water from, as a Class C stream. Class C streams are not considered streams that feed into drinking water tributaries. At some point, The Air National Guard filled out their application listing it as a Class C stream, which had been erroneously listed on the DEC watershed map. The DEC, to their credit, then corrected that designation, naming it a Class A stream. The Air National Guard, to their credit, then amended their application, and when they went to renew their application, and they listed their new application as a Class A stream. Well, if you list it as a Class A stream, there's a certain set of standards and regulatory guidelines that must then flow from that. To date, even before the watershed Washington Lake crisis and through this watershed Washington Lake crisis, the DEC has yet to act upon that stream. Many of us believe it's because you cannot have it both ways regulatorily. You cannot give this permission for the Air National Guard to continue to drain down into Silver Stream and also accept that it's a Class A drinking water stream. And yet it's the city of Newburgh's residents and others that drink our water on a daily basis that are supposed to ignore this regulatory framework that is now existing and say, we've got the granular activated treatment plant, all is well, full steam ahead, drink the water. What we want to do is basically slow down and say that until we're able to address these type of conundrums, or the DEC and the regulatory framework in the state of New York is able to explain how there can be a Class A stream that is discharging out of Wreck Pond that's been measured at 5,900 parts per trillion, and has the trench pits I mentioned earlier at hundreds of thousands of parts per trillion. How can those waters flow down a Class A stream in the Washington Lake Reservoir and there be no problem? And so that's something that we would like to have addressed as part of the discussion about how to strengthen or enforcing current existing regulatory frameworks. Another is to improve the SECRA to screen out bad development. New development should be done in a better, smarter way, and detrimental development practices should not be allowed to continue, or at least should be curbed as much as possible. Many of the water quality problems today, including flooding, polluted runoff, CSOs, etc., are unintended consequences of past decisions, and they stem from actions from the last 20, 50, or 100 years ago, when stream connectivity, watershed dynamics, and water channelization and diversion were generally not factored into development decisions. We are now stuck trying to fix problems from that legacy. But we should not perpetuate the problem by allowing bad development practices to continue. It is a vicious cycle which continuously creates more water protection problems and is not only more expensive for the state in the long run, as referenced in the amount of money that's now being spent for this granular activated treatment plant, but it also undercuts the state's progress towards goals. Possible fixes include looking at development approval processes like the SECRA and permit review and standards. The problem is that the SECRA is a procedural law that seems to be fairly easily skirted, and instead of screening out bad projects, SECRA allows many projects to receive rubber stamp approval when those projects should have received additional scrutiny. I referenced earlier the Matrix Pharmaceutical project. Measured on an economic scale, it seems again to be a no-brainer that this is good for economic development in the region. But when you look at it in terms of the next 30, 40, 50 years, it appears to be a very powerful metaphor of humanity's reliance on the short-term, quarter-to-quarter profit motives, while we go down an ever-thinning branch on a tree that has last remaining pieces of fruit. At some point, it's going to break off. And at some point, all of the things that we have ignored in the name of short-term profit motives are going to come back to haunt us, not only in the watershed for Washington Lake Reservoir, but probably nationwide and worldwide. We have to pay more attention to how the SECRA could be utilized to slow down the very powerful impetus of environmental impacts on economic development, and how economics, more importantly, is impacting environmental considerations. At the end of the day, we would ask that we measure things in more than just quarter to quarter or year to year, but that we see the long term. These regulatory frameworks that we believe the SECRA are intended for just simply need to be strengthened as part of the existing framework, that we don't need to reboot, we just need to redevelop it. We need to enable cities like Newburgh to be able to speak to their neighbors in a way that has the full force of the DEC and the DOH behind them. In many instances, I've drawn the analogy of the Lion King movie where the little lion cub is growling and thinks that its growl is what's convincing its predators to leave it alone until it realizes the big lion is behind it. We need the state of New York to emphasize its power, its regulatory muscle, to convince our neighbors who, if we were in their shoes, I fully admit we would probably be doing exactly what they're doing, which is tending to the economic needs of our community, while the city of Newburgh would have to endure whatever consequences come out of our development decisions and have to bear the burden. I submit to you that the city of Newburgh cannot bear this burden any longer, and our health consequences are only now beginning to be realized. So that while we're looking at the short-term exposure, the short-term legal exposure, there could also be longer-term tort liability as the health impacts are further discovered. We would like to simply suggest that you add a checkbox to the environmental assessment form, that's the EAF form, requiring applicants to indicate whether the project is located in a drinking watershed. For example, is this project located within a drinking watershed as delineated in Map X attached to the application? There could be a layer added to the DEC environmental mapper showing all drinking watershed boundaries in the state or particularly sensitive source water areas. If this box were checked, then a higher level of review should be triggered. We'd be able to ask the question, would the Matrix Pharmaceutical warehouse impact the capacity of the drinking watershed for the city of Newburgh to continue to exercise independence over its own water through the Washington Lake Reservoir? The project may still end up going forward, but the process would be more effective in at least raising the scrutiny of the projects that are potentially harmful to source watersheds and imposing permit conditions that are necessary, and more importantly, being able to accurately measure the true cost of projects that are framed in the short-term frame rather than the long-term frame. It could also ultimately develop a whole new area of common law that creates a cause of action based on the impact that those that are suffering in a watershed from the impacts of either contaminated water or water quantity that's going to be further curtailed. They would have a cause of action perhaps in the future that ultimately actuarials would look at and measure. So we talk about water flowing downhill. A brilliant resident in the city of Newburgh says, well, water can also flow backwards, and that's called money. And if there's a consequence for what's coming down the hill, whether it's through the common law or through a new state-created cause of action, then there may be an opportunity for us to actually get the relative measures right and to enable cities like the city of Newburgh to utilize current tort law in order for it to be made whole from this disaster. The next suggestion is to review the Department of Environmental Conservation stream classifications for water implications. The problem is that the current classification system rationale does not take source water into account. Stream classifications are very important and underpin many of the Department of Environmental Conservation's decisions. How a stream is classified plays a role in permit reviews and other regulatory processes. A suggestion would be to review the classifications for its implication of source water and also review them for accuracy. The next, as I mentioned earlier, is funding. We need to establish a dependable source of long-term funding for source water protection. The problem is that there seems to be a lot of money available for the traditional hard infrastructure, that is the pipes, the valves, storage tanks, etc., through the state's revolving fund for water, managed by the Environmental Facilities Corporation. But source watersheds are a type of water infrastructure, too. They perform capture and filter functions that treatment plants try to replicate. Source water maintenance should be put on equal footing with the traditional hard infrastructure in terms of funding and importance, and we respectfully submit that it is obvious that it is much less expensive to have these natural types of filtration methods rather than the hard infrastructure being the focus of the funding. We respect how the hard infrastructure provides jobs, which themselves are only short-term until the infrastructure is created. But these other sources, nature's sources, for keeping our water pure are time-tested throughout the eons, and we believe that it's only catching up with us now that we've ignored these modern-era best practices that turn out to be really, really, really old-school best practices brought to us by nature herself. We need to make the funding available for source water protection activities. For example, the money can be used to restore wetlands in a source watershed. Just for reference, California recently passed a bill labeled AB 2480 that recognizes 5 Sierra Nevada and Cascade watersheds as important pieces of the state's water infrastructure. We recognize that the best practices in our union tend to originate either on the west or the east coasts. This is a chance for New York State to do a shout out to California and says that this is an opportunity for us to do things in a way that also represent best practices. The new law in California recognizes the importance of restoring forests and streams in these watersheds and makes watershed management projects eligible for state water grant funding. Also award additional points to the SRF applicants who demonstrate that they have source water protection program or are undertaking some other kind of source water protection activities. The rationale behind this is that applicants who show that they are taking care of both their traditional water infrastructure, such as pipes and pumps, as well as their source water infrastructure, i.e. the watersheds themselves, should be rewarded. And finally, we should be able to establish a new source of long-term funding to maintain and enhance watersheds so that there is a sustained program in place for decades to come. Another suggestion is to create a program for water utilities to fund upstream restoration activities. Many laws related to water quality already exist. Field officers have valuable on-the-ground local knowledge and can help identify existing loopholes and gaps. They also have experience in seeing how laws play out in the real world and could share insights on ways to improve effectiveness. The problem here is that there's very few enforcement officers responsible for covering very, very large areas. This could be an opportunity for not only job creation, but to really actually have some teeth that we're able to enforce, particularly for the city of Newburgh, as an example, to be able to call out to enforcement officers to say, these are the things that we're aware of. Can you please assist us with your expertise in going out into the field? You could provide training for the officers, providing on-the-ground tours, field trainings to familiarize them with source water locations, hydrologically important areas for spills, local on-the-ground knowledge, foster connections between ECOs and local municipal staff. I'll give you an example that recently we showed some folks from the Department of Environmental Conservation a swamp area that was large enough to meet the most strictest of regulatory enforcement actions from the DEC before I-84 was constructed. Once I-84 was constructed directly through this swamp, it was subdivided and no longer considered a large swamp, but a smaller swamp, such that the areas that were constituted in these two sub-swamps were no longer considered part of the same swamp, even though nature herself would have disagreed. And because of that, there has been less of a regulatory teeth or opportunities for the DEC. We're hoping for those type of no-brainer misclassifications to be correctly reclassified. In addition, we also understand and want to give credit. We acknowledge that the estuary program has done this training for Orange County officials, the Department of Environmental Conservation spills, and even for our city engineer for the city of Newburgh, and we believe it was very successful. We also have MS4 training going on at City Hall this morning as part of our efforts to train all of our staff in DPW, water, and sewer as it relates to best practices. This program could conduct targeted enforcement of violations related to source water as well. We could conduct more inspections for permit holders located in or near our sensitive source water areas to ensure that permit conditions are being met and that permit conditions still apply. We'd also simply like to, as I mentioned earlier, increase the number of enforcement and inspection staff. We'd also like to create incentives for intermunicipal cooperation and coordination. The example I gave earlier is the Newburgh example. We have neighbors, the town of Newburgh and the town of New Windsor, that we try to coordinate with. But as I mentioned earlier, when it comes down to it, the effective protection of source water is going to involve local level action and hopefully buy-in at some point. And it is common for a municipality such as ours to have little or no control over their source watershed areas because those lands are located in neighboring municipalities. In those situations, it is common for the municipalities to disagree on how these lands should be used, and there is currently a lack of an enforceable mechanism that would enable a municipality to effectively have a say in protecting its source water located outside its boundaries. The suggestion that I have, and many have, is to update the Department of Health watershed rules and regulations. The New York State Public Health Law, Article 11, Section 1100, allows the Department of Health to make rules and regulations, quote, for the protection from contamination of any or all public supplies of potable waters and water supplies of the state, and I want to emphasize, and their sources within the state, close quote. This provision is unique because it enables municipalities to reach beyond their borders into neighboring municipalities for purposes of source water protection. It has been used by many municipalities, and information on the City of Hudson is provided below as an example. However, these regulations are outdated and ineffective. The Department of Health should work with municipalities to approve updates and amendments, and we have heard anecdotally that municipalities have expressed interest, but the Department of Health has not yet been able to approve the updates. The example I give in the City of Hudson gives the following language in their city charter, quote, the rules and regulations hereinafter given, duly made and enacted in accordance with the provisions of sections 1100 through 1107 of the Public Health Law, shall apply to the Tagakik Creek, the Churchtown Reservoir, the Lone Star Quarry Reservoir, and their tributaries in the towns of Tagaknik, Greenport, Cleverack, Hillsdale, and Kopaki, which now serve or which may be developed in the future to serve as sources of the public water supply of the City of Hudson, Columbiana County, New York. And I forgive my mispronunciations. The state public health law has the following corresponding language. Quote, state public health law, quote, City of Hudson, the rules and regulations hereinafter given, duly made and enacted in accordance with the provisions of sections 1100 to 1107 of the public health law, shall apply to the cities that I named earlier, which now serve or which may be developed in the future to serve as sources of the public water supply of the City of Hudson, Columbiana County, New York. The type of activities regulated under these watershed rules and regulations are outdated, and they need to be updated in order to be meaningful. Another suggestion is to reactivate the DEC's Water Resources Planning Council. This is enacted under the New York Environmental Conservation Law, Section 15-2901 from 2015. The Interagency Watershed Resources Planning Council is not currently active. If this council is reconstituted, it could potentially be a way to convene and coordinate various activities related to source water protection. Many have suggested, after hearings in the city of Newburgh, that what is the resistance to all of this? How is it that these have not been emphasized as some of the core figures going forward, given the importance of water? Many have suggested a study trying to correlate campaign donors from the donor cast with those that are ultimately making the decisions that are deciding what are the core figures that are being attended to at the state level, the county level, and the local level, and which ones are not. I would openly submit that those that are advocating for these types of what we call no-brainer responses just don't have the financial juice. But that's where legislators come in, and those that are able to see this through to its a moral imperative, an environmental imperative, in order for us all to have drinking water. We also believe that there could be an opportunity for a rapid response task force, and it might be an opportunity for possible role in intermunicipal coordination. We also suggest providing funding and technical assistance to support source water protection activities. For example, watershed assessments and planning, gathering data and information for resource management, outreach and education on other source water protection tools, such as critical environmental areas, state wetlands, open space plans, EPA, DEC 9 element plans, estuary program grants, and other grants. We've also talked about research projects, and the estuary program currently does or plans to do many of the above. Also convene water operators and municipal DPW teams to explain the importance of source water protection. As I mentioned, the City of Newburgh is hosting such a conference this morning. There are a number of research questions that I respectfully submit. The City of Newburgh does not have the resources to follow through, but we would ask the State Assembly's assistance. Some of them are as follows. Do wetlands and forests have any beneficial effect on water quality in terms of contaminants of emerging concern or micropollutants, i.e. filtering, composition, and breakdown, residence times, absorption of harmful substances? Next question. How does a big patch of forest or wetland have to be? How big does it need to be in order to see measurable improvements in water quantity and quality? How much does that cost compared to building a granular activated treatment plant? Next question. Hay bales are an accepted method of controlling sediment and runoff from construction sites. What are some cost-effective alternatives that perform better? And if possible, require best available technologies to be used at construction sites located in sensitive water source areas. The next area is where are the most vulnerable source watersheds. The current problem is the Department of Environmental Conservation and others themselves, respectfully, need a better understanding of where source water protection is most needed, what areas are well protected, and what source watersheds generally look like throughout the state. Most municipalities do not have basic information about their source watershed and do not have the funding, staff time, or expertise to collect, process, and synthesize the information. The suggestion is that we all work together to create a high-quality, detailed maps of source watersheds and databases with basic information such as source watershed boundaries, locations of source water, intakes, treatment plants, contaminant sources, and major roads. This could include forward-looking information like expected developmental pressures, expected population changes, estimated aquifer volumes in, say, 10, 20, or 50 years, and expected precipitation amounts. We could build these maps if only now we're able to coordinate the data that I believe we all have. The information could help us understand how water is routed through the landscape and water facilities. It was only recently that I learned that the Washington Lake Reservoir is also spring-fed, as well as from source water. That's an important bit of information for the city as we consider other sources of contaminants and other sources of conservation going forward. What does source water protection look like, and what does source water protection look like in the future? What are some steps of interested municipalities and communities can take to protect their source water? Create a list of menu of source water protection tools and mechanisms. Do an internal exchange program. Other countries have been dealing, for example, with source water protection issues for longer than we have, and there are important lessons that we could all learn from them. For example, in many European communities that have been around for a very long time, how do they protect their source water, and what have they found that works or doesn't work? And can New York learn from their experiences as we look to lead the charge on the East Coast? Can we turn vacant lots into source water protection conscious projects? For example, working with developers or municipalities to identify vacant lots and develop them together with private businesses. This could both help the economy and be case studies of source water smart development that yields important economic, social, and environmental benefits. And we could create and foster what many of us are calling the water market. As we look at the increasing scarcity of fresh water, it's only a matter of time before the water market is an item that emerges akin to what is going on in the futures indexes and the water mercantile exchanges. Similar to the solar energy market and the carbon market, there could also be a water market that develops into the future. Green bonds, for example, have been successful. Why not blue water bonds, which could also create a new market? New financing mechanisms for water could encourage and sustain progress towards water management goals. The market could involve stormwater and wastewater credits to improve overall water quality in a region. This would benefit source water as well, since stormwater and wastewater outfalls discharge into source watersheds as well. If there is a cause of action, it's only a matter of time also before the actuarials take note on their insurance policies. And just as many flood insurance riders are no longer available in many home and property insurance, it could also be the case that there will also be a time in the future where there's going to be watershed riders as well that are going to be needed to be added to properties that develop within watersheds where drinking water is, and the vital source of water for the residents is at play. Finally, I'll only briefly talk about education and outreach. We can talk about ways in which those can be incorporated into our curriculum. We could potentially fund customized 3D watershed models for the K through 12 classrooms. We understand the estuary program of the DEC is looking into this, as well as K through 12 water lesson plans, signage at public parks, walkways, and recreation areas. On the subject of signage, I just want to a brief diversion to say that one of the things that we have asked the Department of Transportation for and have not yet received are just simple signs on I-84 that show where the Washington Lake Reservoir watershed begins and ends. This would be helpful for emergency responders in case there are spills within the watershed off that critical interstate, and we believe that it could be accomplished at relatively little cost. We respectfully submit, if signage is up, advertising exits where there are fast food, coffee breaks, gasoline, and hotels, that is also possible, financially feasible, for two simple signs to go up, one eastbound and one westbound, that indicates when you're entering into the Washington Lake Reservoir watershed and when you're exiting it in both directions. Like the Matrix Pharmaceutical Warehouse, it was began construction during this water crisis in the city of Newburgh. We have not yet had a satisfactory response from the DOT. We just are simply asking for 4 signs while we work on the signage with our neighbors in the town of Newburgh and the town of New Windsor. We would also like to have the opportunity for additional funding so that we can engage in coordinated response activities. We've already done one tabletop activity trying to determine how a spill in our watershed would be addressed to decrease the level of toxicity that already exists in Washington Lake Reservoir.
If you could sum up, it would be.
Yes, absolutely.
It would be helpful because your testimony is fascinating, but we have some
Understood.
people who are going to want to share their thoughts with us also.
Yes, sir. The other topics are health monitoring. We think that particularly in a city such as the city of Newburgh's, where a couple of our census tracts are reflective of some of the most dire conditions in the region, a lot of folks who distrust their government, who may not have access to digital technology, may not have the opportunity to even appreciate what is going on still in our water crisis. We think there's an opportunity to reach them. And we'd like to have the opportunity for increased testing and increased monitoring. And we'd like to ask the DOH to continue indefinitely their activities and also to collaborate with the city of Newburgh and to have the funding available through the state in order to do some inventive, creative marketing practices in our hard-to-reach populations. We've shared some of our ideas with the DOH, and we'd like to talk more about that. So what I am going to do is conclude by basically asking that additional water infrastructure and source water protection funding into the next fiscal year budget. We understand that the governor and legislature came together to create the $2.5 billion Clean Water Infrastructure Act, and we thank you for that. We would ask you to consider how that's spread out through the state of New York, given not only those such as the city of Newburgh, Hoosick Falls, and in Long Island that have been discovered, but those that are likely to be coming on board next as the next crisis points in the state of New York could rapidly drain that fund. We appreciate the money, but we ask that there be a retooling of the financial infrastructure in the state of New York to recognize what's going to be required for the next decade. I thank all of you for your patience and your time in hearing from the testimony. On behalf of the City of Newburgh residents, we thank you sincerely for the amount of attention and effort that you have given this. Mr. Martin Brand, Mr. Basil Sagos, Dr. Zucker at the Department of Health have given this, and we ask for a sustained focus on this long after the headlines dry up. We're still going to have the water crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you escape, just comments, questions?
I have a question.
Steve.
You know, the city of Newburgh, as we know, is a financially stressed municipality, and yet your job in making sure that the city does everything you can to protect the water quality of residents comes with many costs. The costs of monitoring all these water sources so that you're able to give the testimony you gave us today, the cost of arranging diversion of water from the Catskills on a temporary basis, and hopefully from your testimony a longer-term basis. How were those kinds of costs worked into your budget and paid for, or did you have other financial partners to help pay for some of these critical costs, but you don't have a budget with lots of money to do all this stuff? So this is a real issue for financially stressed municipalities with challenging water quality issues.
Yes, and I can tell you that the primary cost has been borne on our staff. We would love to tell you that we were able to hire a team of 5 to 10 additional individuals to help us through this crisis, but we simply operate on razor-thin margins. The budget for this year, it contemplates that with our safer funds drying up, for example, for our firefighters, we're going to lose 12 firefighters in August of 18. We're trying to forestall that. So we just simply do not hire. Our engineer, our water superintendent, our DPW team, a lot of us have just given up on a lot of personal time in order to attend to this crisis. We've made up for it by just simply rolling up our sleeves and digging in. We are hoping ultimately to have a promise for continued reimbursement for the Catskills water. That cost has been assumed thus far from the DEC, but we understand that as soon as they deem that the water is drinkable, that's going to be the threshold that terminates the reimbursement arrangement with the New York DEP. So there are other costs involved. Thus far, we have been reimbursed for majority of our costs related to the infrastructure. But what's hidden in this is the toll that it's taken on our team, our legislators, and then our community. While we're already working at razor-thin margins with thin staffs, this crisis befallen on us and rose to being the uppermost priority given its importance of drinking water.
Thank you.
Steve anticipated one of my questions. I am listening to you lay out a complexity of interrelated issues that threaten the very jugular of your community. And my concern is that your community may just be the first one that we're hearing about. You've expressed that same concern. I'm reminded of the movie Chinatown as I listen to you describe the mischief that has apparently helped contribute to the problems that you have. I'm remembering that Faye Dunaway dies at the end, and Jack Nicholson ends up with a cut in his nose for asking too many questions, but it was all about water. In that case, the city of Los Angeles formed the backdrop for a great drama. And you have laid out to us a great drama taking place in this state, on this side of the continent. And I am very concerned that that we work with you. 100 years ago, municipalities were looking at the problems of typhoid and cholera.
Yeah, right.
That has been replaced in our time. We've solved many of those problems, but the greatest challenge to us in our time is emerging contamination issues and planning issues. I would like to extend an invitation to you to sit down with staff, myself, members of the committee. I think we can continue to learn from you, and I would like to work with you to help fashion some of the proposed laws that you have wisely suggested. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Assemblyman Engelbright, and all the members of the panel for this time.